We're going to start with a topic that we dealt with quite a bit earlier this week and last week, too, and that is the whole issue of domestic violence, which has been brought to the forefront mainly because of what's been going on with Ray Rice and all of the things that he's been up to. So there actually is some Ray Rice news today, and I'm going to go to one of the first ones, and let me find it. I've got it here on my list. According to, well, you know what? It just went away. I hate it when it does this. I had it up on my screen, and something popped up over it, an advertisement. You know, I just hate it when that happens. But the story is that, and this is according to USA Today, there is more evidence to suggest that the Ray Rice video, which you may recall, showed him punching the person who was then his fiancée and is now his wife. The video that showed him punching her lights out, essentially, knocked her unconscious inside a casino elevator, was sent to the NFL headquarters to the attention of League Security Chief Jeffrey Miller in April. This is according to a law enforcement official being quoted by USA Today, which is a very reputable, very reliable news organization. Now, the NFL has repeatedly said no one with the league saw the violent images until TMZ Sports released the video earlier this month. They did see him dragging her out of the elevator unconscious, and I guess they must have just thought she fainted because they only gave Ray Rice a 2-game suspension. When the video came out that showed him punching her, then suddenly the suspension became across the board and permanent and all of that kind of stuff, which has opened up the NFL to severe criticism. One of the things that's severe criticisms, I should say, plural, because one of the things certainly that's been going on is the criticism of the NFL that it didn't do enough soon enough to deal with this issue. Now, recently, this came up on the program. Actually, it's a podcast by ESPN's sportscaster and commentator Bill Simmons, and he had some nasty, wasty things to say about Roger Goodell, the NFL commissioner, essentially calling him a lying sack. And I do not mean sack of flour. Those were not his exact words, but he did have what's basically being described as a profanity-laced tirade in which basically he's not buying this idea which Roger Goodell has stated that he has not seen. He had never seen that elevator video. He says that's just a lie. So let's listen in and hear what he says.
I just think not enough is being made out of the fact that they knew about the tape and they knew it was on it. Yeah. Goodell, if he didn't know what was on that tape, he's a liar. I'm just saying it. He is lying. I think that dude is lying. If you put him up on a lie detector test, that guy would fail.
So he's calling him a liar. Says he just doesn't believe it. Now, according to USA Today, where I found this, ESPN has had to slap Simmons around before for previous pie-hole misfires that he made via Twitter. Simmons says, hey, you got a problem with what I'm saying? Bring it on.
I really hope somebody calls me or emails me and says I'm in trouble for anything I say about Roger Goodell.
No, I think it's pretty safe.
If one person says that to me, I'm going public. You leave me alone.
The
commissioner's a liar, and I get to talk about that on my podcast. Thank you.
There you go. We'll bleep the F and the BS maybe, but the other lies.
We'll bleep that. Yeah, we can bleep that.
Yeah.
Please, call me and say I'm in trouble. I dare you.
A lot of people have been saying essentially the same thing. They've been holding the NFL's feet to the fire for having failed to act. And one of the things that's going on, of course, is the whole idea that the NFL should have acted when this domestic violence came to the forefront. It should be doing more to put itself in a leadership role of trying to root out domestic violence with his ranks. This is part of the idea that we need to do more, not only to hold individuals in our society responsible for domestic violence, but also institutions. Now, if you listen to the John C. Scott show that precedes mine, as you should, you may have heard a gentleman that John had on last week named Ed Mercurio Sakwa, who is the executive officer of Emerge. It's a center against domestic abuse. It runs a shelter for battered women, who has, on John's show, floated this idea that we need to do more to hold institutions accountable, and recently wrote an op-ed piece for the Arizona Daily Star saying much the same thing. I've invited him to be on the show to pull this thread further, and he graciously accepted, and he joins us now. Thank you again, Ed, for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
I really, I thought your comments on John's show, and then you elucidated on them further in the paper, were just fascinating. So, first of all, let's, before we get into the idea of institutional responsibility, you've spoken out about how pathetic and insufficient the National Football League's initial response was. So let's pull that thread just a little bit further and tell me what you think they should have done and when they should have done it.
Well, part of it is it's hard in hindsight and from a different perspective. So I don't know that I know what they should do per se. But I think as an employer and as an institution that holds a lot of credibility and a lot of power and influence in our country, that you used the word a few minutes ago, leadership.
Right.
And I think that's the key. So without outlining, exactly what policy they should or should not have, I think the concept here is to show some leadership around this issue and to look to hold the people in their organization to a particular standard. And, institutions send messages to those that are members of that institution, but those in the broader society. And being careful about what kind of message you're sending. Because when you send the message that not only the 2 games, but in comparison to what kind of punishments they were handing out to people who were, first-time marijuana users and things of that nature, you're sending a very strong message about where your priorities lie, what kind of character you expect members of your institution to have, versus taking a very strong stance that says, we want to see something different.
Right. The NFL is not just any employer, obviously. I mean,
right.
it employs athletes that are held up as role models for youth, among other things, role models for adults. And there was a time in this country where that was expected, that athletes, if you were going to be held up in that kind of regard, would have to have a certain amount of character. I would suggest that kind of went by the wayside a long time ago. But you could tell when you watch the team owners and when you watch Goodell talking, they were just shocked by this expectation, that they should hold a punch of a woman in an elevator to be more serious than a punch of a person in a bar brawl. Now, I think they're starting to realize that no, they do have to take it more seriously. Right. They also seem shocked by the notion that really they should have conducted an investigation sort of in parallel with police. So let's pull that thread a little bit. How much of an obligation do you think an organization like the NFL, and let's just narrow it to that right now, an NFL, an organization that obviously has people on its payroll that are held up in a high public regard. How much of an obligation do you think they have to investigate, or do you think that they should have been safe to let police do it all and then tell them what they found?
Well, I think, as you say, the NFL is not any organization or any employer. And when you spend billions of dollars a year to make sure that society sees you and sees everything you're doing and that you are intentionally being an impressionable kind of organization, then it gives you a different level of responsibility, I think, in regards to that. But the reality is that there was a police investigation that they could have followed more closely, independent of their own look into it.
Right, and as I just said, we're finding out more and more about that all the time, that maybe there was some evidence there that they just didn't seem like they were in a real hurry to look at.
Right. So, I mean, I think there probably was some responsibility for them to do some independent investigation on their own, but even separate of that, if they would simply have paid attention to the facts that were already in front of them, gathered by law enforcement, then they would have enough right there.
Right. Now, one of the questions you ask a lot of really good rhetorical questions in your op-ed piece for the that you wrote as a special correspondent for the Arizona Daily Star. And one of them you say, why was there more outrage and why were there more consequences for Ray Rice once everyone could see him hit his fiancée with their own eyes? Why wasn't the initial video sufficient to cause outrage and take significant action against him? What did we all think led to her being unconscious? And I've asked that question too. I mean, it's like what did they think knocked her unconscious? Harsh language. So to me, there was a strong element of hypocrisy when suddenly this video came out and you can see the punch and you could say, oh, now I see how she became unconscious. Really, no new facts were added there, but suddenly the NFL is taking a different action. So that certainly struck me and others as being just a little bit hypocritical. And you don't come out and say it here, but you're certainly questioning it. So I'm guessing that you see it that way too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's disingenuous at best for them to suggest that they didn't know what was happening in there. They did, because they saw the result of it. And what else do you need to know? And I think what we tend to do as people is to minimize things that we don't want to believe are happening. So when it wasn't right in front of us, then all of us, not just the NFL, thought, well, maybe it wasn't quite as bad as we think. Maybe she provoked it, which is a whole nother story
and,
of whether that's a relevant question or not.
A sportscaster got in trouble for suggesting that, too.
Absolutely.
And got suspended for that. We could
spend a lot of time talking about what's wrong in that question.
Right.
But we want to believe there was something other than just him committing a horrible act. And then when we couldn't fool ourselves anymore, it was right in front of us, then we had to address it in some way, even just within ourselves, let alone publicly. And I think for the NFL, it was more about, now others know. And so we have to act differently. We have to say something differently. And so, as I said, I think at best it was disingenuous.
Yeah, I think at best it was, and that's being very generous, because what actually happened was that the NFL was underplaying this. They were holding it basically as being no more serious than being your first time being busted with marijuana or punching somebody in a bar fight. That's how they saw it.
Right.
And no new facts were on the table, but the power of that video, and this is where, as a former television news director, I know what really happened here, because pictures are so much more powerful than words or concepts, and suddenly you can see it with your own eyes. Now they're taking action. But then again, it's hard to come away from that with any lesson other than, okay, so if you're stupid enough to be caught on camera punching your spouse, then we'll take action, which, of course, by the way, led to another round of jokes on Fox News, and some of those people got in trouble.
Right.
But then again, though, I mean, isn't that really what we've learned here? That if you really, seriously, and truly get totally busted, then you're in trouble. Until that point, it's business as usual. So how can we get past that? How can we get to the point where, you know what? No, we know you punched your wife's lights out. You're in trouble for that alone. How do we get to that point?
Well, I think it's a question of what are we really concerned about here? What matters to us as people, as a society, as employers? Are we concerned about every single person who might be a victim of this, or are we worried about the ones, as you said, that we can see? And if our concern is that this shouldn't exist for anybody, then we don't worry about whether there's a videotape or not. That's just not a factor. The issue is, if this is going on, then this person needs to be held accountable. And so I think we have to get our morals in line and decide what really matters to us.
After the break, we have to take one. I want to start getting into the broader issue. What if you are an employer, but you're not the NFL? What do we need to do, or do we need to do anything to hold other types of institutions, other types of employers accountable in these situations? And we'll discuss that when we come back from these messages. All right, we're back with Ed Mercurio Sakwa, and we're talking about domestic violence. Ed, one of the things that you wrote, and this is really the whole point of why I wanted you to get on, because I think this is the new territory where we're going. And you mentioned this on John C. Scott's show, and then you said it again here, and I just want to read it. What you said, in our society, we still have, excuse me, I'm getting tied up in my own words here. It says, why do institutions such as the NFL only change their domestic abuse policies after intense negative publicity? What other major institutions in our society still have harmful or non-existent policies related to domestic violence? And where is the call for those groups to change without needing to wait for one of their employees to get caught on tape knocking a fiancé unconscious? So let's talk about other institutions. I have absolutely no problem saying, I don't think anybody else does either except the NFL, saying that, if you are an institution that you're a public entity, you've got public figures on your payroll, you have a higher bar. But now when you start to spread it out to other institutions, we're sort of in new territory here. So you asked the question, I don't think you really answered it. Let's talk about it further. What do you think other institutions have in terms of a responsibility as it pertains to their employees and the issue of domestic violence?
Well, I think let's step back to the broader picture for a second. So, in my mind, the definition between prejudice and an ism, sexism, racism, what have you, is the backing of institutional power behind that.
Okay.
And so that's where I think the responsibility of an institution comes into play, is that it doesn't absolve an individual of complete responsibility and accountability for their own choices and actions. However, there's also a context to that, a societal context where various institutions, including those more broadly in society, but those that are most close to that person, like their particular employer, have an influence. There are messages sent by those institutions. If they back up and say, no, this is not what we expect in terms of character and behavior of people that are going to work and represent our organization, that sends a message. If they say nothing, that sends a message. If they do things that overtly show tolerance for those behaviors, that sends a message as well. So that's where I think the responsibility lies, is that backing of those broader institutions and employers influence and set a context in which individuals then behave.
So if you're going to extend to just regular employers,
sure,
this idea that they should have a social consciousness on this issue and that they should start holding their employees accountable, does that open the door to say basically that our employers should be watching us to the same extent and to the same level as, for instance, police officers? If you get involved in any kind of criminal activity, that the police need to investigate, but then so does the employer. How far down that road do you think we need to go?
I don't think it necessarily has to be that. I think, a lot of employers have drug-free workplace policies.
Right.
I think it's very comparable to that. It's a lot of employers have policies that say if you've been convicted of a crime, we need to know that because we might take action as a result. That's what I'm saying, is simply that why wouldn't domestic violence, which is a crime, be counted in that same kind of category? To say there's a reason that employers have a drug-free workplace policy. There's a reason they don't want people who have active substance abuse problems who are committing crimes related to it. If somebody was caught selling crack, or somebody was caught robbing a bank, many employers would say that is not a person who can work here. What's the difference in saying this person is going and committing a crime? It happens to be inside their home as opposed to out in the community, but it doesn't make it any less of a crime. And so why wouldn't we have the same assessment of whether we want that person working here? But then there's also policies that aren't just about the abuser and about do we terminate everybody that we believe might be committing domestic violence. There's also policies that support the victims, because very, very often domestic violence follows victims to work, both literally and figuratively. So many times that abuser is harassing that person at work, showing up at their job, looking to get them fired so that they have financial dependence back on them instead of having their own income. But then also the stress that somebody's going to bring to work when they know what's when what's happening at home spills over to their ability to focus at work. So there's a very selfish reason for employers to care about how victims of domestic violence are supported, what kinds of security and safety measures are put in place, things like that. So it's a broader look at a domestic violence policy. It's not just what do we do with offenders.
There's an unspoken assumption, I think, in a lot of businesses, but I wouldn't necessarily say all, but certainly a lot. I know every television newsroom I've ever worked for, it's been known that if you get in serious legal trouble, it's probably going to affect your job.
Right.
But then again, television newsrooms have a similarity to the NFL in that a lot of people, but not all, but a lot of people on the payroll are public figures. But we also know that in the workplace, certain things tend to get codified into regulations. For instance, anti-harassment rules, rules against drunk driving. A lot of those, though, also reflect on the employer's concern that if you engage in these behaviors, it's going to affect the work product. We don't want you driving drunk because if you drive a company vehicle. We don't want you taking drugs because it could affect your employment. Not your employment, your performance. What responsibility do you think employers have in terms of helping their employees understand that this is a very serious issue? You will be held accountable. Do you think they need to start putting things like that in their rules, like they would DUI, like they would drug abuse, like they would sexual harassment, all of which in most companies today are codified in the HR rules?
Right. And that's my question and my point is simply that why would this be different?
Right.
Why is it that just because this happens between people that are in a relationship with each other or in their home, it's different? It's still a crime, and it's still has the same impact on productivity. It has the same impact on the branding, the image of that company, all the things they'd be worried about with something else. Why not this too?
We got about a minute left, and the last question I want to ask you is, is let's say that society agrees with you and we go there, and you start to see companies that say this is something in particular that we would not tolerate. Do you expect companies, what kind of level of expectation would you like to see set for the level of investigation that companies ought to do when they see a charge like this? We have 45 seconds left.
I don't think that's necessarily the role of companies to conduct independent investigations of situations. I think it's a matter of when you have information in front of you, which doesn't necessarily mean something from the police. I think you've got to listen to that victim involved in the situation as well. But when you have information in front of you, then I would hope that they would act.
Okay. Listen, you've been great to come share your time with us today. I think you've made some great points. And this is something we all have to be thinking about. And thanks in part to Ray Rice, I think we are all thinking about it now. And there are all kinds of implications for all of us. So I think you've shared some great insight, and I thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.